The cavernous expanse of the Silverpine packhouse was supposed to be a place of ancestral reverence and absolute warmth during the grand spring choosing ceremony. Instead, it became the moment Maria Sterling's entire world shattered. Hundreds of elite wolves had gathered under the high vaulted ceilings, their hushed whispers echoing off the ancient obsidian pillars. Blazing torches lined the stone walls, casting long, flickering shadows across the polished granite floor. The air was thick with the scent of melted beeswax, fresh pine needles, and the electric anticipation of a royal mating ritual. Positioned in the exact center of the ceremonial circle, Maria kept her chin perfectly level. The heavy fabric of the lunar royal sash rested across her collarbones, an intricate masterpiece of deep midnight blue silk woven with brilliant silver threads. It was the sacred mantle of the future Luna, a garment meant to formally bind her to the most powerful male in 3 realms. Beneath the long sleeve of her simple white gown, her skin hummed with a fierce, quiet heat. An unseen claiming mark rested against her left wrist, pulsing like molten gold. It was a secret, searing tether that connected her soul to the Alpha King. For weeks, that hidden brand had been her only comfort in a court that constantly mocked her quiet nature. It throbbed in rhythm with her own racing heartbeat, offering a steady, somatic reassurance of the bond they shared in private. She closed her eyes for a brief second, drawing in a slow breath of the incense-heavy air, trusting the summer warmth that radiated from her marked flesh. She believed the unbearable weight of the court's judgment was finally coming to an end. A few paces away, near the raised dais of the ancestral throne, stood Cassandra Vance. The ambitious stepmother wore an exquisite gown of dark crimson velvet, her posture radiating an aristocratic, cold-blooded authority. Maria could smell her from across the circle. It was an overwhelming olfactory assault of sweet, cloying gardenia that entirely failed to mask the bitter, clinical scent of chemical rot lingering just beneath the surface. Cassandra offered the surrounding nobles a sweet, practiced smile, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Yet, her eyes remained fixed on the young woman in the center of the hall, glittering with a toxic, predatory anticipation. There was a quiet, suffocating smugness in the older woman's demeanor, a silent promise of impending ruin that made the golden heat on Maria's wrist suddenly spike with a sharp, warning twinge. The heavy iron doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a deafening groan, and the entire assembly instantly fell into a breathless, terrifying silence. Draven Valerius had arrived. The Alpha King of the Silverpine territory was a mountain of lethal muscle and absolute authority. His massive physical frame seemed to absorb the torchlight, his broad shoulders wrapped in a thick cloak of black winter fur. Normally, his mere presence sent a wave of comforting, protective resonance crashing over his fated mate. Under normal circumstances, the moment he entered a room, the fated seal upon her wrist would burn with a fierce, possessive joy. But as he strode down the center aisle, his heavy boots striking the stone with a rhythmic, military precision, Maria felt nothing but a sudden creeping wall of solid ice. She opened her eyes and looked at the man she loved. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. Draven's face was a mask of unyielding stone. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles feathered beneath his skin, but his expression was entirely devoid of the fierce, protective warmth he always reserved for her in secret. But it was his eyes that sent a cold spike of pure terror straight down her spine. The king's irises, normally the color of a raging winter storm, were entirely eclipsed. A subtle, unnatural violet mist swirled violently across his gaze, clouding his pupils with a dark, artificial haze. He moved with a stiff, mechanical grace, his raw dominance suppressed under a heavy, invisible weight. He did not look at her like a sovereign approaching his beloved queen. He looked at her like an executioner approaching the block. Draven stopped exactly 3 feet away from her. The proximity should have ignited the mating bond into a roaring inferno. Instead, the golden pulse against her wrist began to stutter, cooling rapidly into a frantic, dying ember. He stared down at her, his expression utterly blank, the violet mist thickening in his eyes until no trace of the man she knew remained. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual deep, chest-rattling resonance. It was flat, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. His words cut through the silent hall like a rusted broadsword, echoing off the obsidian pillars for every single wolf to hear. "Before the ancestors and the moon," Draven announced, his tone echoing with a hollow, mechanical finality. "I reject Maria Sterling of the Lower Vales as my mate and future Luna. She is defective. Her blood is weak, her wolf is silent, and she holds no place at the side of a king." The words did not just hurt. They tore through the invisible sacred tether binding their souls, inflicting a catastrophic, physical agony. The claiming mark on her left wrist, once burning with the heat of a summer sun, blistered violently under her skin, the golden veins blackening as they instantly turned to frost-cold ash. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. The sensation was violently visceral. It felt as though a jagged fault line of solid ice had just cracked open behind her ribs, splintering her sternum from the inside out. Her lungs seized, unable to draw in the heavy, incense-laden air. The somatic shock of the severed bond plunged her internal temperature into an instant, agonizing hypothermia. She could feel her own heartbeat slowing, struggling to pump blood through veins that suddenly felt packed with freezing snow. The entire pack erupted into a chaotic chorus of sneers, cruel gasps, and triumphant whispers. They watched eagerly, waiting for the weak, defective girl to collapse. They waited for her to fall to her knees on the hard granite. They waited for the tears, the desperate begging, the pathetic pleas for the king to change his mind. Cassandra took a deliberate step forward on the dais, her crimson skirts rustling against the stone, her smile widening into a display of absolute, victorious cruelty. She waited for the young outcast to break. Maria did not break. She did not beg. She did not even allow her breathing to quicken. The excruciating, freezing agony radiating from her chest was paralyzing, but she locked it away behind a fortress of sheer unbreakable willpower. She looked up into Draven's misted, violet eyes, searching for a single flicker of the man who had whispered ancient promises against her skin just nights ago. There was nothing, only a toxic, empty void. Her beautiful, stoic face remained entirely unbothered, carved from pale marble. She reached up with steady, calloused hands and gripped the edges of the lunar royal sash resting on her shoulders. With a single fluid motion, she lifted the sacred blue and silver silk from her neck. She did not throw it. She simply opened her fingers and let it drop. The heavy fabric hit the dusty stone floor with a soft, dismissive thud. The absolute, dignified silence of her reaction stunned the grand hall. The cruel whispers died in the throats of the nobility. No one moved. Even Draven seemed to flinch on a purely instinctual level. A microscopic twitch of his jaw as the silk hit the floor, though the violet haze quickly suffocated the reaction. Maria did not offer the Alpha King a bow. She did not offer him a single word of farewell. She simply turned her back on the most powerful male in 3 realms, ignoring the gasps of the assembled pack, and began walking toward the heavy iron doors. Every step required a monumental, agonizing effort, her frozen blood fighting gravity, but her posture remained flawless. As she pushed through the massive threshold and stepped out into the biting winds of the northern winter, another figure watched the scene unfold from the high, shadowed balconies of the packhouse. Kalen Vex leaned against the cold stone railing, his dark robes blending perfectly with the unlit corners of the gallery. The ruthless commander of the rogue dragon clan had infiltrated the ceremony to assess the strength of the Silverpine wolves. What he witnessed instead was the spectacular, foolish self-destruction of a king. Kaelin possessed the ancient sight of his draconian ancestors, a sensory gift that allowed him to view the raw currents of magic in the physical world. He did not care about pack politics. He cared about power. Kaelin looked down from the balcony and watched as the heavy doors slammed shut behind the outcast girl. The moment the iron latch clicked into place, the atmospheric magic of the grand hall instantly shifted. It was an olfactory and visual collapse. The scent of ozone and burning wax turned stale. The grand, blazing torches lining the walls suddenly flickered, their bright orange flames shrinking into pale, sickly blue embers. Kaelin narrowed his predatory, slitted eyes. He looked toward the great stone hearth at the center of the dais, the sacred fire that represented the moon goddess' blessing upon the ruling line. The roaring flames were visibly dimming, choking on their own ash. The divine light was actively retracting from the Silverpine territory, bleeding out of the very stones because the arrogant king had just cast out its true dormant vessel. A dark, dangerous smile curved Kaelin's lips. The Alpha King had just severed his kingdom's throat, and he did not even realize it yet. The Dragon Commander turned away from the dimming hall, his mind already spinning, with the tactical advantage of this monumental error, slipping silently back into the shadows to prepare his clan for the inevitable vulnerability of the wolf territories. Outside, the brutal reality of the northern blizzard immediately consumed the rejected bride. The wind howled through the towering, snow-laden pine trees, carrying the bitter bite of true winter. Maria walked away from the glowing windows of the packhouse, plunging directly into the deep, hostile snowdrifts. The journey into the remote Frostpine Valley was treacherous, a grueling test of physical endurance that would have killed a normal human. She pushed through knee-deep snow until the muscles in her thighs burned with a fierce lactic fire, and then she walked further still. The freezing wind whipped her dark hair violently against her pale cheeks, biting into her exposed skin through the thin white fabric of her ceremonial gown. The environmental cold was severe, numbing her fingers, her face, and her toes, but it could not possibly touch the frozen wasteland spreading through her chest. The severed mating bond was a constant, somatic agony, a jagged block of ice sitting heavily directly behind her sternum. Without the ambient, protective warmth of her alpha, her internal temperature continued to plummet. Her wolf spirit remained completely locked and silent, suppressed by the shock of the rejection, denying her the ability to shift and survive the blizzard in a furred form. She was entirely vulnerable, a fragile, solitary figure moving through a landscape designed to crush the weak, yet she kept moving. She wrapped her thin arms tightly around her torso, leaning her weight forward against the crushing pressure of the gale. The jagged rocks, hidden beneath the snow, scraped against her thin ceremonial slippers, bruising her heels, but she refused to stop and rest. Resting meant freezing, and freezing meant giving Cassandra exactly what she wanted. Maria focused her mind entirely on the rhythmic crunch of the snow beneath her feet, using the repetitive, sensory sound to drown out the phantom sensation of Draven's mechanical voice echoing in her ears. "We are small things in a world of teeth," she reminded herself, recalling a quiet lesson from her childhood. Smallness is a gift. Use it. She embraced the sheer invisibility of her situation. The storm swallowed her tracks almost as quickly as she made them, filling in the deep footprints with fresh, powdery snow. The capital city of the Silverpine Pack slowly faded into the swirling white abyss behind her, taking its cruelty, its toxic nobles, and its poisoned king along with it. She did not mourn the loss of the royal sash. She did not mourn the loss of the luxurious chambers or the ancestral throne. The only thing she mourned was the brief, secret illusion of safety she had found in Draven's arms. But that illusion was shattered now, replaced by the stark, freezing truth of the wild. By the time the pale, grey light of dawn began to plead to bleed through the heavy storm clouds, she had crossed the territorial border, officially entering the desolate, unclaimed expanse of the Frostpine Valley. It was a rugged, forgotten land of steep glacial cliffs and dense, frozen forests, avoided by the elite packs due to its harsh resources and brutal climate. For Maria, it was a perfect sanctuary. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. She would build a new life in this quiet, frozen exile. She would heal the jagged ice in her chest with her own bare hands, and she would never, ever look back at the kingdom that had thrown her away. 3 months had passed since the brutal winds of the spring choosing ceremony. The remote, unforgiving expanse of the Frostpine Valley had not killed the exiled bride. Instead, it had hardened her. The sanctuary cabin sat nestled against the steep, jagged base of a glacial cliff, heavily protected from the biting northern gales by a thick grove of ancient, snow-dusted cedar trees. The crude timber logs had been chopped and stacked by her own hands, packed tight with frozen mud and dried moss to keep the lethally cold drafts at bay. Inside the sturdy wooden structure, the atmosphere was a stark, intentional contrast to the bitter hostility of the wilderness. The air was thick and deeply comforting, saturated with the rich, earthy scent of boiling pine needles, dried yarrow root, and the smoky warmth of a roaring hearth fire. Maria Sterling stood at the heavy oak table, her hands rhythmically grinding dried herbs in a stone mortar. Her movements were precise, steady, and entirely unhurried. She wore simple, functional garments woven from coarse grey wool, a far cry from the delicate, suffocating silks of the capital. Her dark hair was braided tightly down her back, keeping it out of her face as she worked. But beneath the surface of this quiet domestic peace, a violent, invisible war was raging. Her left wrist was bound tightly in layers of thick, unbleached linen, concealing the catastrophic physical toll of the severed fated bond. The once glowing claiming mark had devolved into a necrotic, frostbitten scar. It throbbed with a sickening, icy pulse, sending jagged spikes of piercing agony up her arm and straight into her sternum. Every beat of her heart felt like it was pumping crushed glass and winter snow through her veins. The physical deprivation of her alpha was a literal, biological starvation, yet she refused to let it show. The heavy wooden door creaked open, letting in a brief, swirling gust of winter air before it was quickly shoved shut. Toby Miller stood in the entryway, his small boots caked with fresh snow, his arms wrapped tightly around a massive bundle of chopped firewood. The young, orphaned wolf pup was completely mute, his vocal cords paralyzed by the trauma of a rogue attack that had wiped out his family months ago. He had been wandering the valley, starving and half-frozen, until Maria had found him collapsed in a snowdrift. She had not pitied him. She had simply pulled him into the warmth, wrapped him in blankets, and given him a safe home. Toby marched over to the hearth, his face set in an expression of fierce, solemn determination, and carefully stacked the logs. Once his task was complete, he walked over to the table and leaned his small, sturdy frame against the young woman's side. He did not ask for attention. He simply offered his quiet presence. Maria paused her grinding. She reached down with her uninjured hand and gently stroked the boy's scruffy hair. Toby closed his eyes, leaning into the touch, anchoring her to the present moment. In this broken boy, she had found a profound mirror of her own survival. They both understood the absolute power of silence. A sharp, rhythmic knock echoed from the heavy door. Toby instantly stiffened, his small hands curling into fists, but the stoic Omega gently squeezed his shoulder to calm him. "It is a friend, Toby," she murmured, her voice soft but completely steady. The door opened again, revealing the towering, broad-shouldered frame of Gavin Thorne. The loyal beta of the Silverpine pack stepped into the warmth of the cabin, aggressively shaking the heavy layers of snow from his dark fur cloak. Gavin was a man defined by practical observation and unswerving devotion to the true welfare of his people. By royal decree, any contact with the exiled female was strictly forbidden, punishable by severe imprisonment. Gavin did not care. For the past 3 months, he had been secretly crossing the treacherous territorial borders, bringing vital medical supplies, salted meats, and heavy blankets to the sanctuary. He had watched Maria build this haven with her bare, bleeding hands, and his respect for her had grown into an unshakable reverence. "The northern pass is freezing over faster than usual," Gavin said, his deep voice carrying a rough, exhausted edge. He set a heavy canvas sack of provisions onto the floorboards. "I brought enough willow bark and dried venison to last you through the deep freeze. The capital's stores are dwindling rapidly, but I managed to secure what you needed." "You take too many risks, Gavin," Maria replied, stepping away from the table to pour a steaming cup of herbal broth from the iron kettle over the fire. She handed the warm clay mug to the massive warrior. "If Cassandra catches you smuggling rations out of the royal vaults, she will have you stripped of your rank and banished." Gavin accepted the mug, wrapping his large, collused hands around the warm clay, his sharp, observant eyes flicked to the thick linen bandages wrapped tightly around the exiled bride's left wrist. He could smell the subtle, metallic tang of blackened blood lingering beneath the scent of the medicinal herbs. "My rank means nothing in a rotting kingdom," he replied flatly, his jaw clenching with suppressed anger. "The pack is failing. The crops in the lower vales are covered in an unnatural frost. The protective wards around the capital are actively dying. The moon goddess is stripping her blessing from the land, because the true Luna was cast out." Maria's face remained a mask of flawless, pale marble. She turned her back to him, focusing her attention on wiping down the heavy oak table. She carefully folded the cleaning cloth and set it down, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She did not want to hear about the kingdom. She did not want to hear about the people who had stood by and laughed while her soul was shredded on the ceremonial floor. "Cassandra and Elena are ruling in all but name," Gavin continued, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "They parade around the pack house in crimson silks, issuing decrees while the common wolves starve. And Draven—" The beta hesitated, the name catching painfully in his throat. He looked down at the dark broth in his mug. "Draven is decaying. He is completely unrecognizable. He locks himself in the high chambers, refusing to see the council. He is physically collapsing, Maria. The broken bond is poisoning him from the inside out." The words sent a violent, involuntary shiver down her spine. The icy block behind her sternum throbbed fiercely in response to her alpha's name, but she ruthlessly crushed the sensation, burying it beneath a fortress of sheer willpower. She did not look back. She did not let her hands tremble. "He made his choice before the ancestors," Maria said, her voice entirely devoid of anger, echoing with a quiet, terrifying finality. "He claimed Elena. He rejected my blood. His decay is the consequence of his own sovereign decree." "He was not in his right mind," Gavin insisted, stepping forward, his massive frame radiating desperate frustration. "You saw his eyes. You saw the violet mist. Cassandra has done something to him. I know it. I have been secretly searching her chambers, tracking her movements. I will find the source of the poison, and when I do, I will break it." The young woman finally turned to face the beta. Her dark, storm-calm eyes held no hope, no anticipation, and no forgiveness. "Even if you find it, Gavin, it does not change the past. A mind may be poisoned, but the words were spoken. The bond was severed." She looked down at Toby, who was staring up at her with fierce, protective loyalty. She placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. She looked at the sturdy wooden walls of the sanctuary she had built, the drying herbs, the warmth of the hearth, and the safe, quiet peace she had carved out of the ice. "Thank you for letting me go," she thought, the silent realization settling deep into her bones. Because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better purpose, a better family, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. Miles away, far beyond the jagged glacial peaks and the bitter winds of the valley, the silver pine pack house was suffocating under a thick, unnatural darkness. The cavernous grand hall, once a place of vibrant warmth and roaring hearths, now felt like a colossal, echoing tomb. The torches lining the obsidian pillars burned with a sickly, pale blue light, struggling to consume the stale, ozone-heavy air. Fine layers of grey ash had settled over the pristine granite floors, untouched by the servants, who were too terrified to wander the halls at night. The entire capital was steeped in an olfactory nightmare. A pervasive, sickening blend of wilted, rotting gardenias and the sharp, metallic sting of old copper. Deep within the restricted royal wing, in the opulent isolation of the high chambers, Draven Valerius was losing a catastrophic biological war. The Alpha King, a man who commanded the absolute fear and respect of 10,000 elite wolves, staggered blindly across the thick velvet carpets of his private study. His massive physical frame, normally radiating an aura of suffocating, dominant heat, was currently racked with violent, uncontrollable tremors. He gripped the edge of a heavy, mahogany desk, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to keep himself upright. The severed fated bond was acting as a highly aggressive, necrotic poison within his bloodstream. Without the tethered, answering warmth of his true mate, his cellular structure was systematically collapsing. Draven's breathing was ragged and shallow, tearing through his throat in wet, desperate gasps. His skin, usually flushed with the vital, burning heat of an alpha, was ghastly pale, completely leached of color. Dark, bruised shadows hollowed out his cheekbones, making his face look like a beautifully carved, macabre skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a low, agonizing groan that sounded more like the whimper of a dying beast than the roar of a sovereign. His biology was screaming for the mate it had been brutally torn away from, but his cursed mind could not comprehend the source of the agony. The compliance curse, the dark, suffocating magic Cassandra had woven into his brain, fought aggressively to suppress his true memories. Every time his soul reached out for the quiet, stoic girl with the coal-used hands, the violet mist violently flooded his mind, drowning the thought in a sea of artificial, clinical apathy. The paradox was literally tearing his nervous system apart. Suddenly, a massive, paralyzing spike of piercing agony erupted directly behind his sternum. It felt as though a jagged, serrated blade of solid ice had just been driven straight through his heart. Draven's eyes shot open, the irises violently flickering between their natural raging storm grey and the toxic, unnatural violet haze. He could not breathe. His massive legs gave out completely. The Alpha King crashed to the floor, his heavy knees slamming brutally against the cold stone tiles. He curled inward, clutching his chest, his powerful muscles seizing in a state of absolute hypothermia. A violent cough ripped its way up his trachea. He hacked aggressively, his body convulsing until he spat a thick mouthful of dark, freezing blood onto the pristine white fur rug beneath him. He lay there, gasping, shivering violently in the opulent silence of his gilded cage, a broken puppet dying on his own strings. From the deep, unlit shadows near the towering balcony doors, a figure watched the king's pathetic collapse with absolute, predatory stillness. Kaelan Vex stepped silently into the dim light of the chamber, his dark robes making no sound against the stone. The rogue Dragon Clan priest had bypassed the packhouse's failing magical wards with insulting ease. He was not here to assassinate the king. The king was already doing an exceptional job of executing himself. Kaelan was here to observe the exact mechanism of the wolf pack's destruction. Kaelan slowly approached the writhing, gasping Alpha. He looked down at the dying king with a mixture of clinical fascination and cold disgust. The dragon commander activated the ancient sight inherited from his ancestors. His slitted, reptilian pupils expanded, allowing him to perceive the raw, invisible currents of magic flowing through the physical realm. The sight was deeply grotesque, wrapped tightly around Draven's brainstem and sinking deep into the muscular tissue of his heart were thick, pulsing chains of dark violet magic. They looked like venomous, ethereal leeches glowing with a toxic, sickening light, continuously pumping a suppressive, mind-altering frequency directly into the sovereign's nervous system. It was an ancient compliance curse, a highly illegal and extremely complex piece of dark magic designed to completely subvert the victim's free will while leaving their motor functions intact. The dragon priest narrowed his eyes, tracking the origin of the magical tether. The violet chains did not generate from Draven himself. They extended outward, slithering invisibly across the stone floor, passing straight through the heavy oak doors of the study, and trailing up toward the eastern wing of the pack house, directly into the luxurious, heavily guarded chambers of Cassandra Vance. A cold, dangerous smirk curved Kaelin's lips as the realization clicked into place. The ambitious stepmother was using a physical artifact, an obsidian compliance pendant, to puppeteer the most powerful male in 3 realms. She had forced him to reject his fated mate, completely unaware that by severing the divine bond, she had triggered a biological self-destruct sequence in her own puppet. Cassandra believed she had executed a flawless, bloodless coup. She believed her reign over the Silverpine territory was absolute and untouchable. She was wrong, because the loyal Beta was already hunting the truth, and soon the Alpha King would awaken to reclaim what was his. Kaelin knelt gracefully beside the shivering Alpha. Draven's eyes fluttered, the storm grey briefly piercing through the violet fog. His pale, blood-stained lips moved, forming a desperate, barely audible whisper that the curse could no longer completely silence. Ma-Ria. The dragon commander stood up, his dark eyes glittering with lethal anticipation. The Alpha King was broken, the kingdom was rotting, and the true vessel of the Pack's magic was exiled in the northern snow. Keclan turned his back on the coughing king and dissolved seamlessly back into the shadows. He did not need to raise an army to conquer the wolves. He only needed to wait for the ticking time bomb in Draven's chest to finally explode. The heavy oak doors of the high chambers swung open, their rusted hinges whining in protest against the creeping neglect that had entrenched itself over the passing months. Elena Vance stepped into the freezing, dimly lit study, her posture radiating an arrogant, unearned authority. She wore a delicate sweeping gown of crimson silk, an insulting contrast to the agonizing stagnation that had slowly strangled the kingdom outside the packhouse windows. The once magnificent royal study, previously a symbol of absolute sovereign power, had fully surrendered to the elements, resembling a forgotten, ice-bound tomb. Months of unlit hearths had left the ashes cold and calcified, while frost spiderwebbed permanently across the high stained glass windows, sealing out the moonlight entirely. Elena carried a thick stack of territorial decrees pressed against her chest, visibly annoyed that the puppet king had failed to attend the morning council. "Mother requires your signature on the lower Vale borders, Draven," Elena snapped, her voice sharp and devoid of any genuine concern. She paused, her nose wrinkling in profound disgust. The Alpha King was currently writhing on the white fur rug, his massive frame convulsing as he coughed up thick, freezing blood. The long-settled corruption of the broken bond hung heavy in the room, a festering misery that had seeped into the very tapestries over the season. But cutting cleanly through that familiar decay, Elena detected something entirely new. A sharp, crackling scent of pure ozone and ancient, burning amber. From the deep, unlit shadows near the towering balcony doors, Kaelin Vex stepped into the dim light. The rogue Dragon Clan priest moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his dark robes seeming to swallow the ambient light. He stepped carelessly over the frozen bloodstains on the rug, his expression one of clinical amusement. Elena gasped, dropping the parchment decrees onto the stone floor, her arrogance instantly evaporating into sheer, paralyzing terror. "Who are you?" she demanded, taking a trembling step backward toward the door. "Guards, intruders in the royal wing." "Your guards are deaf to this room, little wolf," Kaelin murmured, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the dying Alpha. "I must admit, I am profoundly disappointed in your mother's arcane craftsmanship. A compliance curse drawn from a cheap obsidian pendant? It is remarkably sloppy, It forces the body to act against the primal instinct of the soul. That kind of internal paradox generates friction, and friction generates decay. The artificial magic is violently rejecting his biology. It is killing the host, and frankly, a dead king is terribly boring. "You do not understand what you are interfering with," Elena stammered, pressing her back against the heavy wood, her breath hitching in her throat as she desperately sought an escape. "The Silverpine territory belongs to us now." Before Kaelin could offer another mocking reply, the heavy oak doors were violently kicked inward, the iron hinges screaming as they tore loose from the stone frame. Beta Gavin Thorne stood in the shattered threshold. His broad chest was heaving with exertion, and his heavy leather armor was battered, still layered in the thick, biting winter frost from his secret journey back from the Northern Territories. His expression was a mask of unadulterated fury. In his gauntleted left hand, he held a dark, violently pulsing stone that radiated a sickening necrotic energy. It was the obsidian compliance pendant. "I tore your mother's chambers apart to find the source of this rotting sickness, Elena," Gavin snarled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, suppressed rage. His eyes flicked briefly to the rogue priest, standing in the shadows, but the Beta did not falter. His priority was the salvation of his king, and the survival of the true vessel. "You and Cassandra thought you could bury a true fated bond beneath cheap parlor tricks. You were wrong." Kaelin simply crossed his arms, leaning back against the frozen stone wall with a dark, glittering smile. "Ah, the loyal hound returns," the priest whispered, thoroughly entertained. "Let us see if he bites." Gavin did not hesitate. He raised his heavy steel-plated boot and slammed the obsidian compliance pendant onto the unforgiving stone floor. With a brutal, echoing crack, the Beta crushed the dark relic beneath his heel, grinding the ancient, cursed glass into fine, useless dust. The reaction within the study was violently instantaneous. Thick, pulsing chains of dark violet mist, the physical manifestation of Cassandra's compliance curse, suddenly became visible as they writhed frantically around Draven's brainstem. They looked like venomous leeches, deeply embedded in his neural pathways. As the obsidian pendant shattered, the violet chains began to blister and burn from the inside out. The sound of the curse breaking was deafening. A catastrophic, high-pitched screech, like ancient glaciers shattering under extreme atmospheric pressure. The sickening stench of the obsidian magic, that cloying mix of sweet gardenia and rot, was instantly incinerated by the sharp, pure scent of ozone. One by one, the ethereal chains snapped, the dark mist dissolved into nothingness, leaving the Sovereign's mind completely unprotected and brutally raw. Kaelin offered Elena a mocking, theatrical bow. "The puppet's strings are cut. Give your mother my regards," he whispered, before dissolving seamlessly into a shadow that slipped through the cracks of the shattered balcony window, vanishing into the night. On the floor, Draven Valerius stopped convulsing. He lay perfectly still for a long, agonizing moment, his broad chest rising and falling with ragged, desperate breaths. Then, the memories hit him. It was not a slow, gradual realization. It was a torrential, catastrophic flood of truth that slammed into his frontal lobe with the force of a physical blow. He remembered the fierce, protective warmth of the hidden claiming mark on Maria's wrist, the way her skin tasted like summer rain. He remembered the quiet, stoic grace of her smile in the dark when she thought no one was watching. And then, he remembered standing in the center of the grand hall, trapped inside the suffocating, silent cage of his own skull. He remembered watching helplessly as his mouth moved to speak the words that destroyed her. He remembered the absolute, dignified silence with which she had dropped the Lunar Royal sash. He remembered the way the heavy silk hit the stone floor, the sound echoing like a death knell in his ears. He remembered the excruciating, freezing agony of the fated bond snapping, a jagged, fault line of solid ice cracking open behind his ribs. He had felt her lungs seize, he had felt her internal temperature plummet, and his cursed, clouded mind had simply watched her walk away into the blizzard. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest until he could barely draw breath. Without the numbing agent of the violet mist, the full, crushing weight of his biological starvation crashed down upon him all at once. The severed bond was a cavernous void in his chest, a necrotic, bleeding wound that screams for the mate he had exiled. Gavin Thorne watched the fallen king slowly push himself up from the floor. Draven's massive hands gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles cracking under the immense pressure. When the Alpha King finally lifted his head, the unnatural violet mist was completely gone from his gaze. His irises were a raging molten storm grey, burning with a lethal, unadulterated fury and an unfathomable depth of heartbreak. The pure, primal aura of the absolute apex predator exploded into the confined space, dropping the ambient temperature by 10 degrees in a single second. The glass in the remaining windows shattered outward from the sheer pressure of his dominance. Gavin felt the terrifying weight of that aura and instantly understood the danger. "He remembers," Gavin whispered to himself, his blood running cold. The beta knew the volatile, entirely unhinged state of a starved alpha whose true mate had been ripped away. He knew that Draven's primal wolf would not care about politics, explanations, or diplomacy. The beast would simply hunt. It would tear the earth apart to find what it had lost, and it would crash down upon Maria's quiet sanctuary like a localized hurricane. Knowing that Maria was completely unprotected from this chaotic, violent reunion, Gavin did not waste a single second. He turned on his heel and sprinted back down the royal corridor, his heavy boots hammering against the stone. He had to abandon the rotting capital. He had to secure the fastest war horse in the royal stables and ride straight back to the Frostpine Valley. He had to warn Maria before this desperate, bleeding sovereign arrived at her door. Cassandra believed she had executed a flawless coup. She believed the Alpha King was merely a docile puppet dancing on her obsidian strings. She was wrong. Because the Alpha King had finally discovered the truth, and he was coming for what was his. Draven did not speak to Elena, who had collapsed against the far wall in absolute terror. He did not even bother to punish her. The overwhelming, biological need to find his mate violently overrode any instinct for political vengeance or justice. He lunged past the terrified girl, crashing through the remains of the shattered oak doors. He burst out of the royal wing, shifting mid-stride. Bone cracked, muscle expanded, and the man disappeared, replaced by a colossal, terrifying black wolf. He tore through the grand hall, leaving a trail of absolute panic in his wake, and launched himself out into the biting northern blizzard, driven entirely by a desperate, bleeding soul. The journey into the northern wilds was a grueling, suicidal descent into pure physical agony. The blizzard howled through the towering, snow-laden pines, whipping bitter, ice-laced winds against Draven's thick black fur. The ambient temperature was lethal, but the external cold was nothing compared to the freezing void spreading endlessly inside his chest. Every leap through the deep, treacherous snowdrifts sent a fresh wave of piercing agony, radiating from the cavernous emptiness where his mating bond used to reside. His paws were bloodied and torn by the hidden jagged rocks buried beneath the ice, leaving a faint, tragic trail of crimson across the pristine white landscape. But he did not slow down. He could not stop. His wolf spirit, suppressed and suffocated for months by the dark magic, now clawed frantically against his ribs, howling an endless, silent plea for the missing half of its soul. He tracked her using the faintest, lingering echoes of a scent that was permanently branded into his marrow. It was a visceral, somatic pull, a magnetic drag on his very blood that guided him blindly through the relentless winter storm. Beneath the overpowering smell of winter frost and damp, decaying earth, he finally found the subtle, clean notes of dried yarrow, pine needles, and Maria. The scent was a fragile lifeline, a desperately thin thread, pulling him toward the remote, unforgiving expanse of the Frostpine Valley. As he drew closer, the necrotic emptiness in his chest began to ache with a terrible phantom warmth, a cruel, agonizing reminder of the bond he had shattered. By the time the heavy, grey clouds broke to reveal the pale, unforgiving light of morning, the colossal black wolf finally emerged from the northern tree line. His breathing was ragged, wet, and incredibly shallow. The physical toll of the necrotic bond had fundamentally compromised his biology, and the sheer exertion of the desperate run had pushed his failing heart to the absolute brink of catastrophic collapse. He saw the sanctuary cabin nestled securely against the steep base of the glacial cliff. The crude timber logs, packed with frozen mud and moss, radiated a faint, warm, steady glow from the hearth within. Standing outside the heavy wooden door, rhythmically chopping firewood, was Beta Gavin Thorne. Gavin paused, his massive broadsword immediately drawn at the sight of the approaching beast. Having ridden through the night at a breakneck pace to beat his king to the valley, the Beta's protective instincts flared instantly, ready to defend the sanctuary with his own life. But as the colossal black wolf stumbled blindly into the clearing, its front legs giving out entirely in the deep slush, the seasoned warrior lowered his blade in stunned, quiet disbelief. He recognized the storm-grey eyes, now wide with a frantic, broken desperation that he had never seen in his king. Draven shifted abruptly back into his human form, his massive, heavily scarred body completely naked to the freezing wind. He collapsed heavily into the knee-deep snow, his powerful muscles seizing from the extreme hypothermia and the unbearable, crushing weight of his profound grief. The cold bit viciously into his exposed skin, but he barely registered the pain. Gavin quickly unclasped his own heavy fur cloak, stepping forward to throw the thick, warm garment over his king's violently trembling shoulders. "Draven," Gavin said, his voice a rough, conflicted mixture of shock and reluctant pity. He had witnessed the king's decay in the capital, the slow, pathetic wilting of a great, untouchable ruler. But seeing the most feared sovereign in 3 realms reduced to a shivering, broken shell crawling in the mud was profoundly jarring. The majestic, terrifying leader was entirely gone. In his place was only a ruined male, desperately searching for the piece of his soul he had carelessly discarded. Draven did not answer. He did not issue a royal command. He did not demand entry into the warm cabin. Instead, he forced himself up onto his hands and knees. The Alpha King, commander of 10,000 elite warriors, crawled. He dragged his heavy, bleeding body through the freezing mud and icy slush, his bare knees scraping raw against the jagged stones, moving inch by agonizing inch toward the sanctuary door. The heavy oak door slowly opened. Maria Sterling stood in the threshold. The sensory contrast between them was stark, absolute, and deeply painful. She was wrapped in clean, simple grey wool, standing securely in the comforting, smoky warmth of the hearth light. Her dark hair was neatly braided, her posture radiating an unbreakable, profound, stoic calm. He was covered in freezing mud, his own drying blood, and the catastrophic, tragic ruin of a shattered mind. Behind her legs, young Toby Miller peered out, his small hands clutching the coarse fabric of her skirt tightly, his mute gaze wide with apprehension at the sight of the bleeding stranger. Maria did not gasp. She did not sneer. She simply observed the utter ruin of the man she had once loved, her storm-calm eyes betraying absolutely nothing. Draven looked up at the beautiful face he had dreamed of every single night for months while trapped inside his violet nightmare. The sight of her stoic, completely unbothered expression physically destroyed whatever fragile remnants remained of his composure. He collapsed completely flat against the ground, pressing his forehead directly into the freezing slush at the very tips of her worn leather boots, and then the Alpha King began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a raw, visceral, chest-heaving breakdown. Deep, guttural sobs tore violently through his massive frame, shaking his broad, powerful shoulders as he clung desperately to the muddy hem of her dress. "Maria," he choked out, his voice a hoarse, desperate, broken rasp. "Maria." please. She did not move away, but she did not reach down to comfort him. Beneath the thick linen bandages, wrapping her left wrist, the necrotic, frostbitten scar gave a sudden, sharp, terrible twinge. It was a microscopic ghost of its former glowing warmth, responding violently to his extreme physical proximity. The ancient, biological instinct of the Omega to comfort her distressed Alpha surged powerfully in her veins, demanding that she drop to her knees and pull his heavy, weeping head against her chest. But she ruthlessly crushed the sensation, burying it deep beneath a fortress of sheer, impenetrable willpower. She remembered the freezing, lonely trek through the deadly blizzard. She remembered the agonizing, endless nights spent crying silently in the dark, clutching her chest as the severed bond nearly stopped her fragile heart. She looked down at the weeping sovereign, her face carved from pale, unyielding marble, completely untouched by his desperate tears. "I was poisoned." Draven sobbed uncontrollably, his fingers trembling violently as they gripped the wet, coarse fabric of her skirt. "The pendant. Cassandra. I was trapped inside my own skull, Maria. I saw myself reject you. I heard the brutal words, but I couldn't stop them. The mist, the violet mist, it suffocated my wolf. I swear to the ancestors, I never wanted to let you go. I am so sorry. I will burn the capital to the ground for what they did. I will do anything. Just please, give me a chance to earn you back." The chilling distance in her expression remained absolute and unbroken. She observed his agonizing, physical pain, clearly recognizing the profound sincerity of his immense grief, but her true priority was the quiet, safe haven she had meticulously built from the ice. She gently placed a protective maternal hand on Toby's shoulder, using her unshakable silence as an impenetrable, sovereign shield against his chaotic storm. "A mind may be poisoned, Draven," she finally replied, her voice carrying no malice, no anger, only an insurmountable, quiet distance that cut deeper than any blade. "But you chose to let Cassandra into the packhouse. You allowed her unchecked ambition to fester, ignoring the repeated warnings of your true loyalists. The obsidian pendant was merely the weapon. The vulnerability that allowed it to strike was entirely your own. You cast me out to freeze. I built my own fire. I do not need yours anymore." He lifted his heavy head, his handsome face streaked with freezing tears and dark, thick mud, his storm-grey eyes begging desperately for a single tiny flicker of mercy. "I will fix it. I will spend the rest of my life crawling on broken glass to fix it." Maria took a single calm step backward into the soothing warmth of the cabin, gently but firmly pulling the hem of her skirt from his desperate, trembling grasp. The quiet movement was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly final. "You cannot fix what has been entirely reduced to ash," she said softly, the tragic words hanging heavily in the bitter winter air, "and you cannot earn back what no longer exists. I am not your Luna anymore." She did not slam the heavy door. She closed it slowly, the heavy iron latch clicking securely into place with a hollow, echoing finality, leaving the most powerful male in 3 realms kneeling completely alone in the freezing mud, utterly and completely destroyed. The heavy iron latch clicked securely into place, and the absolute finality of the sound echoed across the desolate Frostpine Valley. Outside the sanctuary cabin, Draven Valerius remained on his hands and knees in the freezing mud. The brutal northern wind whipped relentlessly against his bare, scarred back, driving shards of ice against his skin, but he did not move. He was completely numb to the environmental hostility. The only thing he felt was the cavernous, necrotic void in his chest, a jagged hollow that had just been permanently sealed by the woman he loved. The Alpha King, commander of 10,000 elite warriors, simply let his heavy head hang, his breath frosting in the bitter air as his tears mingled with the dark slush beneath him. Beta Gavin Thorne stood a few paces away, his massive broadsword lowered, his expression heavy with a profound, solemn grief. He had witnessed the absolute destruction of his sovereign. He knew that Maria's rejection was just, earned by the king's fatal vulnerability to Cassandra's ambition, but watching the mighty Alpha shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces was a deeply agonizing sight. The Beta took a slow, deliberate step forward, the snow crunching loudly beneath his heavy, steel-plated boots. He reached down, gripping the thick fur cloak he had thrown over Draven earlier, intending to pull his king up from the mud. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the valley was the ragged, broken breathing of the ruined king. A heavy, absolute silence settled over the snowy clearing, freezing the world into a tableau of profound grief. Then, before Gavin's corloosed fingers could grasp the fabric, the atmospheric magic of the valley violently shifted. It was an instant, terrifying sensory collapse. The howling winter wind, which had been roaring continuously through the ancient cedar trees, stopped dead. An unnatural, suffocating stillness descended upon the clearing. The ambient temperature, previously hovering at a lethal, freezing low, suddenly spiked with a sickly, oppressive heat. The sharp, clean scent of pine and fresh snow was entirely incinerated, replaced by a dense, suffocating wave of pure ozone, burning amber, and the distinct, metallic tang of raw draconian magic. Gavin's head snapped up, his keen, observant eyes scanning the dense tree line. His primal wolf instincts flared, sending a violent spike of adrenaline straight into his bloodstream. The shadows between the snow-dusted trunks were moving. They were not wolves. They moved with a fluid, reptilian grace, their bodies wrapped in dark, heavy leather armor that absorbed the pale morning light. Kaelan Vex had not just observed the rotting capital. The rogue Dragon Clan priest had dispatched his elite assassins to finish the job. Knowing that the true vessel of the Pack's magic had been exiled, the rogues had bypassed the failing wards of the Silverpine territory entirely, striking directly at the unprotected Frostpine sanctuary to ensure the wolves would never rise again. An ambush, Gavin roared, his deep voice shattering the unnatural silence. He hoisted his massive broadsword, his muscles coiling tight as he stepped protectively between the tree line and the cabin door. Rogues! On the ground, Draven Valerius stopped, shivering. The word cut through his crushing grief like a jagged blade. The Alpha King lifted his head from the mud, his storm-grey eyes, previously clouded with desperate, weeping sorrow, instantly snapped into the hyper-focused, lethal glare of an apex predator. The transition was terrifying and absolute. He was a ruined, decaying male who had just lost the only thing keeping his soul tethered to the earth, which made him infinitely more dangerous than a healthy king. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. Draven did not bother to stand. He pushed off the frozen ground with explosive, feral force, shifting mid-air. The sound of cracking bone and expanding muscle was deafening, echoing across the clearing as the man vanished, replaced by a colossal, heavily scarred black wolf. His massive beast form was emaciated, his ribs visibly jutting beneath his matted fur due to the biological starvation of the severed bond, but his sheer, unadulterated fury compensated for the decay. The first wave of assassins breached the clearing, their hands glowing with volatile, crackling spheres of elemental fire. They did not aim for the Beta or the Alpha. They aimed directly for the heavy oak door of the sanctuary. The first sphere of draconian fire slammed into the side of the cabin, exploding with a deafening, concussive boom. The impact sent a shockwave of blistering heat across the snow, instantly vaporizing the deep drifts into thick clouds of boiling steam. The sturdy timber logs, packed with frozen mud, splintered violently, the wood instantly catching fire. Inside the cabin, the domestic peace was violently shattered. Maria Sterling was thrown off her feet by the concussive blast, her shoulder slamming hard against the stone hearth. The heavy oak table splintered, sending clay mugs and dried herbs scattering across the floorboards. The air instantly filled with choking, acrid smoke and the terrifying roar of unnatural flames eating through the ceiling. Toby Miller let out a silent, terrified scream, his small hands covering his ears as he scrambled beneath a heavy wooden cot, desperately trying to hide from the chaos. Maria did not hesitate. The stoic, quiet Omega, who had accepted her own brutal public rejection with absolute stillness, transformed instantly into a fierce, protective matriarch. She scrambled through the blinding smoke, her lungs burning, and threw herself over Toby's trembling body. She grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker, her calloused hands gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was no warrior, she possessed no combat training. But she would absolutely die before she let these monsters touch the child she had sworn to protect. Outside, the clearing had devolved into a brutal, chaotic slaughter. Gavin fought with the mechanical, ruthless efficiency of a seasoned war commander, his heavy broadsword cleaving through the dark armor of the rogues, but they were vastly outnumbered. The Dragon Clan assassins were fast, their movements augmented by the volatile magic pulsing through their veins. But they had not calculated the sheer, unhinged desperation of a fated mate defending his final tether to humanity. The colossal black wolf moved like a localized hurricane of teeth and shadow. Draven did not fight to survive, he fought to annihilate. He lunged at a rogue preparing to launch another fireball at the cabin, his massive jaws snapping shut around the assassin's throat with a sickening crunch. The rogue's fire magic misfired, exploding harmlessly into the sky as Draven violently shook the man, tossing the broken body aside into the snow. Another assassin swung a serrated blade, slicing a deep, gaping wound across the Alpha's shoulder. Draven did not even flinch. He spun, his massive paws crushing the attacker's chest cavity against the frozen earth. Every movement cost the Alpha King dearly. The necrotic void in his chest throbbed with paralyzing, physical agony. His failing heart, already severely compromised by the severed bond and the brutal run through the blizzard, stuttered violently in his chest. Black, freezing blood dripped from his jaws, mixing with the crimson blood of his enemies. He was a dying beast pushing his cellular structure leagues beyond its biological limit, fueled entirely by the desperate, roaring need to keep the quiet girl inside that burning cabin safe. The heavy wooden door of the sanctuary finally gave way, collapsing inward under a barrage of elemental strikes. An enormous rogue assassin, his arms wreathed in twisting, serpentine flames, stepped over the splintered threshold. His reptilian eyes locked instantly onto the corner where Maria was shielding Toby, her iron poker raised in a fragile, desperate defense. The assassin sneered, raising his burning hands. The vessel dies today. Before the rogue could unleash the blast, the entire wall of the cabin exploded inward. Draven crashed through the burning timber like a catastrophic force of nature. Splinters of flaming wood and shattered stone rained down as the massive black wolf slammed directly into the assassin. The sheer kinetic impact threw the rogue across the room, smashing him through the opposite wall and back out into the freezing snow. Draven landed heavily on the floorboards, his breathing ragged, wet, and terrifyingly shallow. His dark fur was singed, smelling of burnt ozone and raw copper. He planted his massive, bleeding paws between the gaping hole in the wall and the corner where Maria crouched, a living, breathing shield of muscle and fury. Maria stared at the colossal beast. The necrotic, frostbitten scar on her left wrist suddenly gave a violent, excruciating throb, responding to his immediate, protective proximity. She could see the severe, lethal damage his body was taking. She could see the way his back legs trembled, fighting a losing battle against complete muscular failure. Yet he did not retreat. He stood between her and the fire, a ruined king offering his final, bleeding devotion to a queen who had cast him out. The fight outside was far from over. Gavin roared as he severed another assassin's arm, but a new, terrifying figure emerged from the dense, smoky tree line. It was the lieutenant of the Dragon Clan, a towering, heavily armored warrior carrying a massive, glowing staff forged from dark volcanic glass. The lieutenant did not bother engaging the beta. He locked his gaze directly on the gaping hole in the sanctuary wall, focusing entirely on the exposed, vulnerable targets inside. The lieutenant raised the volcanic glass staff. The ambient temperature in the clearing spiked to an unbearable, blistering high. All the ambient elemental magic in the valley was violently sucked toward the tip of the weapon, condensing into a blinding white-hot sphere of pure, concentrated draconian fire. It was a siege-level blast, an executioner's strike designed to incinerate heavy stone fortresses, let alone a fragile timber cabin and the people inside it. The attack was aimed directly at Maria and Toby. Draven saw the light pooling at the tip of the staff. His heightened wolf senses instantly calculated the trajectory, the speed, and the catastrophic, absolute lethality of the impending blast. There was no time to grab Maria. There was no time to push them out of the way. There was only a fraction of a second to make a choice. He did not hesitate. As the blinding, white-hot sphere of draconian fire launched from the staff, tearing across the clearing with a deafening, supersonic shriek, the colossal black wolf leaped directly into its path. Draven threw his entire massive body directly in front of the elemental blast, acting as a complete physical barricade between the lethal magic and the woman he loved. The impact was catastrophic. The sphere of concentrated fire struck Draven squarely in the chest, exploding with a devastating, earth-shattering shockwave. The sheer force of the elemental kinetic energy shattered his ribs instantly, the sound of breaking bone echoing like cannon fire over the valley. The volatile draconian magic rapidly incinerated his thick fur, burning straight through his heavy muscle tissue and searing his flesh to ash. The Alpha King was thrown backward with brutal ragdoll violence, crashing heavily onto the splintered floorboards of the cabin, sliding until he hit the base of the stone hearth. "No!" Gavin roared from the courtyard, his voice tearing with absolute, profound horror. The Beta launched himself at the lieutenant in a blind, feral rage, his broadsword sweeping in a lethal arc that cleanly decapitated the distracted Dragon Clan commander. The remaining assassins, seeing their leader fall and the objective supposedly met, instantly scattered, dissolving into the smoky shadows of the tree line. Inside the ruined, burning cabin, a terrifying absolute silence descended. Draven Valerius lay crumpled against the stone hearth. He had shifted back into his human form upon taking the lethal damage, his massive, heavily scarred body now a canvas of catastrophic, fatal wounds. The draconian blast had essentially caved in his chest, leaving a massive, horrific burn that exposed charred bone and ruined tissue. His breathing was not just shallow. It was a horrifying, wet rattle, the sound of a sovereign's lungs rapidly filling with his own blood. Maria dropped the iron poker. The heavy metal clattered against the floorboards. She did not scream. The profound, stoic distance that had protected her for months entirely vanished, shattered into a million useless pieces by the sheer, staggering magnitude of his sacrifice. She scrambled across the debris-littered floor, her grey wool dress soaking up the freezing slush and ash, and fell to her knees beside the dying king. "Draven," she whispered, her hands hovering over his ruined chest, entirely unsure of where to touch him without causing more agony. "Draven, look at me. Look at me." His eyelids fluttered, heavy and uncoordinated. The storm-grey irises were dilated, rapidly losing their fierce primal light, fading into the dull, glassy stare of impending death. He coughed, a weak, wet sound, and a thick stream of dark crimson blood spilled past his pale lips, running down his jaw. He did not look at his horrific wounds. He did not cry out in pain. He only looked at her. His trembling, blood-soaked hand slowly lifted from the floorboards. It was a monumental, agonizing effort, his muscles failing, but he forced his arm to move until his heavy, collused fingers gently brushed against the side of her pale cheek. The touch was incredibly light, completely devoid of his usual commanding authority, holding only a desperate, profound reverence. "Safe," Draven rasped, his voice barely a breath, forcing the single word past the blood choking his throat. "You are safe." He had not asked for forgiveness. He had not asked her to take him back. He had simply looked at the woman who had coldly rejected him moments prior. calculated the cost of her survival, and paid for it with his own life without a single second of hesitation. Maria stared down at the broken, bleeding man in her arms. The absolute, unadulterated purity of his devotion slammed into her with the force of a falling mountain. Because when I saw you lying there, broken and abandoned, something in me roared that I had to save you, even if saving you destroys me. The silent realization echoed violently through her mind. He had not come here to conquer her. He had come here to die for her. As Draven's hand went entirely limp, slipping from her cheek to fall heavily onto the ash-covered floorboards, his chest stopped moving. The faint, wet rattle of his breathing ceased entirely. The Alpha King of the Silverpine territory was dead. No, Maria breathed, the word tearing out of her throat in a raw, ragged gasp of absolute refusal. No, 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 you do not get to leave me like this. You do not get to die before you earn me back. She pressed both of her calloused hands directly flat against the center of his ruined, catastrophic chest wound. The physical contact with his charred flesh sent a violent jolt of shock through her nervous system, but she did not pull away. She leaned over him, her dark hair falling like a curtain around his pale, lifeless face, her tears finally breaking free to trace hot, desperate paths down her cheeks and drip onto his skin. Deep within her biology, an ancient, dormant power responded to her profound, agonizing grief. The cosmic solar lineage, suppressed for generations and hidden entirely beneath her low-status Omega presentation, finally heard the desperate, roaring plea of its true vessel. It did not require a pack ceremony. It did not require a royal decree. It only required a bond forged in absolute, sacrificial love. The necrotic, frost-bitten bond scar upon her left wrist suddenly burst open. It was not a painful, burning heat. It was a blinding, magnificent, roaring flare of pure, molten gold. The thick linen bandages wrapped around her wrist instantly disintegrated into fine white ash. The dark, necrotic tissue of the severed scar was aggressively consumed by a brilliant, celestial light, the jagged fault lines filling with a glowing, radiant energy that rivaled the midsummer sun. The magnificent golden light rapidly traveled up her arm, glowing brightly beneath her skin until it reached her hands. Maria gasped, throwing her head back as the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the cosmic solar magic flooded her veins. The dark, cold, freezing void in her chest, the icy wasteland that had tortured her for 3 months, was instantly incinerated. A shockwave of pure, blinding warmth exploded outward from her body, blowing the thick smoke and freezing winter chill entirely out of the ruined cabin. The ambient temperature in the sanctuary spiked into a comforting, absolute summer heat. The golden light poured from her palms directly into Draven's catastrophic wounds. It was a visceral, somatic reversal of death. The cosmic magic did not just close the injuries, it aggressively rebuilt him. The charred, ruined tissue of his chest rapidly knit itself back together, the skin weaving over repairing muscle and bone in a display of supreme, ancestral power. The sickening scent of ozone and burnt copper was entirely washed away, replaced by the rich, deep fragrance of sun-warmed earth, blooming gardenias and pure, roaring summer fire. The magic sought out the deepest, most fundamental damage. It reached into the cellular decay caused by the severed mating bond and violently reconnected the tether. Maria felt the jagged, serrated edges of her own soul reach out, entirely bypassing the physical realm, to grab hold of Draven's fading spirit. She slammed their souls back together, welding the bond shut with the absolute unbreakable heat of 1,000 suns. Draven's back arched violently off the floorboards. He drew in a massive, ragged, desperate breath, his lungs expanding perfectly within a completely restored, flawless chest cavity. His eyes flew open. The dull, glassy stare of death was gone, instantly replaced by the vibrant, roaring storm grey of his irises, now ringed with a brilliant, pulsing halo of golden solar light. The biological starvation was over. The cosmic solar crest had manifested, elevating their bond and locking it into an invincible resonance. He stared up at Maria. She was bathed in a magnificent, glowing aura, her dark hair floating slightly in the ambient magical current, the golden sigil on her wrist blazing like a beacon of absolute sovereignty. She was not just a quiet Omega anymore. She was a supreme divine vessel, beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, radiating a terrifying, protective warmth. Maria lowered her face, her chest heaving as the blinding light slowly began to recede, settling into a deep, steady pulse beneath her skin. She kept her hands planted firmly against his warm, rapidly beating heart, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm that she had just ripped back from the grave. Draven reached up, his large, warm hands gently grasping her wrists. His touch was no longer hesitant or weak. It was entirely solid, thrumming with the fierce, protective heat of an alpha who had just been handed back his entire world. He pulled her down, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent as if it were oxygen, his massive shoulders shaking with quiet, profound reverence. "I am here," Maria murmured against his dark hair, her voice steady, rich and vibrating with an ancient, undeniable authority. "I am here." Outside the ruined cabin, Beta Gavin Thorne stood in the blood-stained snow, lowering his broadsword. He watched the blinding golden light fade from the shattered walls of the sanctuary, feeling the sudden, overwhelming warmth that had banished the winter storm. He fell to his knees in the slush, bowing his head in absolute, unquestionable submission. The true Luna had not just survived the ice, she had conquered it, and the kingdom would never be the same. The journey back to the capital was not a march of vengeance. It was a steady, unstoppable dawn breaking over a frozen world. The brutal northern blizzards that had terrorized the Silverpine territory for months entirely dissolved, retreating before the radiant cosmic warmth that pulsed continuously from Maria Sterling's skin. The ambient temperature shifted from lethal, biting frost to the deep, comforting heat of a midsummer afternoon. She walked beside Draven Valerius, not behind him. The colossal, heavily scarred Alpha King matched her measured pace exactly, his broad shoulders angled protectively toward her. Every few minutes, his storm-grey eyes would drop to the glowing golden crest, marking her left wrist, as if he still could not quite believe the catastrophic void in his chest had been permanently sealed. The fated bond between them was no longer a jagged fault line of ice. It was a continuous thrumming river of molten gold, anchoring his restored soul to hers with an invincible resonance. Behind them, Beta Gavin Thorne carried young Toby Miller on his massive armored shoulders, the mute wolf pup's face buried safely in the thick fur of the warrior's cloak. The small, broken family moved with a quiet, undeniable sovereignty toward the rotting heart of the pack. Months of unchecked corruption had turned the cavernous expanse of the Silverpine packhouse into a suffocating, toxic nightmare. The Grand Hall, once the proud, beating heart of the territory, now suffocated beneath the pervasive, sickening stench of wilted gardenias and absolute chemical decay. Fine grey ash had settled thickly over the obsidian pillars, a physical testament to the kingdom's slow death, and the torches flickered with a pale, dying blue light. Positioned upon the raised dais of the ancestral throne, Cassandra Vance sat draped in exquisite, sweeping layers of dark crimson velvet. The ambitious stepmother looked down at the shivering, starving common wolves gathered in the hall with a display of absolute, cold-blooded contempt. Beside her, Elena wore a smug, practiced smile, entirely confident that the rogue dragon clan had turned the exiled bride to ash. They believed their reign was absolute, cemented in the blood of a puppet king and a discarded Omega. "The Northern Vales will double their winter tribute by nightfall," Cassandra announced, her voice echoing sharply off the granite floor, dripping with clinical cruelty. "Any wolf who fails to meet the quota will be stripped of their rank and banished to the ice. The era of Draven's weak, sentimental rule is permanently over." The heavy iron doors at the far end of the Grand Hall did not merely swing open. They were violently blown inward, the rusted hinges screaming as the massive slab's metal slammed against the stone walls with a deafening, concussive crash. The entire elite assembly instantly froze in breathless, paralyzing terror. Draven Valerius stepped over the shattered threshold. The Alpha King was not the pale, coughing puppet they had watched decay for months. He was a mountain of lethal muscle, his chest bared to reveal the horrific, jagged burn scar left by the draconian fire, a permanent testament to his sacrifice. His irises burned with a raging, unadulterated storm-grey fury, ringed with a brilliant halo of golden solar light. The sheer primal pressure of his dominance crashed into the hall, dropping the ambient temperature of the usurpers to a freezing, absolute zero. The pack guards, instinctively reaching for their weapons, instantly dropped to their knees, their bodies entirely subjugated by the return of their true apex sovereign. But Draven did not march toward the throne. He stopped just inside the doors, turning his massive frame to the side, and gently extended his collused hand. Maria Sterling stepped into the gloom of the packhouse. The moment her worn leather boots touched the dusty granite floor, the atmospheric magic of the capital violently, spectacularly reversed. The sickly pale blue torches lining the walls erupted into towering pillars of blazing golden fire. The scent of chemical rot and cloying perfume was instantly incinerated, washed away by a roaring sensory wave of sun-warmed earth and blooming summer flora. The heavy, oppressive shadows clinging to the vaulted ceiling shattered, chased away by the radiant, celestial aura pouring from the stoic Omega. She wore no crimson silks, no royal sash, only her simple, ash-stained grey wool, yet she radiated a terrifying, divine authority that eclipsed every noble in the room. Cassandra shot up from the ancestral throne, her face draining of all colour, her crimson skirts tangling around her ankles as she stumbled backward. "Impossible," she gasped, her voice cracking in raw, unadulterated panic. "The compliance curse, the rogues, you are dead." Maria did not raise her voice, she did not sneer. She walked slowly down the centre aisle, her beautiful face carved from pale, unyielding marble. The golden emblem on her wrist blazed like a miniature sun, casting long, sharp shadows behind the terrified nobles who had once laughed at her exile. Draven walked exactly half a step behind her, a living, breathing shield of muscle and devotion. When they reached the exact center of the ceremonial circle, the very spot where he had destroyed her world months ago, the Alpha King stopped. He did not look at Cassandra. He turned his massive, imposing frame entirely toward Maria. And then, before the stunned, breathless assembly of the entire Silverpine elite, Draven Valerius dropped heavily to his knees on the hard stone floor. The collective gasp from the nobility echoed off the high ceiling, but Draven ignored them all. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders trembling with profound, quiet reverence, and pressed his forehead against the back of her collused hand. "I was poisoned by ambition and my own fatal blindness." Draven's voice resonated through the silent hall, raw, transparent, and vibrating with deep, chest-heaving sincerity. He did not hide behind the curse. He took absolute public accountability. "I allowed a dark magic to subvert my mind, and in doing so, I cast out the only true light this kingdom has ever known. I broke your heart, I shattered our bond, I left you to die in the ice." He lifted his head, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers, completely exposing his ruined, vulnerable soul to the woman who had pulled him back from the grave. "You survived my cruelty. You built a sanctuary from my ruins. You owed me nothing, yet you gave me back my life. I am completely, irrevocably unworthy of the breath in my lungs. I strip myself of all sovereign authority. I yield the absolute power of this pack to you, Maria. My life, my beast, and my crown are yours to command or yours to discard." The dramatic irony of the moment was absolute and deeply satisfying. The untouchable, feared beast of the North, the most powerful male in 3 realms, was publicly, willingly surrendering his entire empire at the feet of the quiet, low-status girl they had all mocked. He was not claiming her, he was begging for the privilege of serving her. Maria looked down at the kneeling king. The somatic feedback of their bond pulsed with a warm, steady, overwhelming wave of his absolute devotion. She gently pulled her hand from his grasp, but she did not step away. Instead, she turned her stoic, storm-calm gaze toward the dais, fixing her eyes on the trembling stepmother. "Guards!" Cassandra shrieked, her aristocratic composure entirely shattered into pathetic, desperate hysteria. "Kill her! She is an imposter! She is a defective Omega practicing dark magic! Strike her down!" Not a single wolf moved. They were entirely paralyzed by the divine, suffocating pressure of Maria's solar magic. Beta Gavin Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the main doors, his heavy steel-plated boots echoing with lethal finality. In his hands he carried thick, heavy chains forged from cold black iron. He marched straight up the steps of the dais, his face a mask of unyielding, brutal justice. Elena screamed as the massive warrior shoved her aside, grabbing Cassandra by her delicate, crimson-clad shoulders and forcing her brutally to her knees. The sharp, metallic clatter of the heavy chains binding the stepmother's wrists rang out like a death knell for the corrupt matriarchy. Maria walked slowly toward the base of the throne, the golden light of her cosmic lineage illuminating the terrified faces of the usurpers. She looked at Cassandra, observing the pathetic, squirming reality of a woman whose entire power relied on shadows and poison. "You poisoned a king's mind to steal a crown that was never meant for your head," Maria said, her voice echoing with a rich, ancient authority that vibrated in the marrow of every wolf present. She did not scream. Her quietness was infinitely more terrifying. "You subjected your own people to starvation and ice, believing that a girl who had never been seen could not return to break your illusions." Cassandra spat on the stone floor, her eyes wide with toxic madness. "You are nothing. You are a collused maid in beggar's wool. You will never be a true Luna." Maria simply tilted her head, the golden solar mark upon her arm flaring with magnificent, blinding heat. "I am Maria Sterling, vessel of the sun, Luna of the north, and the breaker of the obsidian curse," she stated softly, her words carving an absolute, unchangeable truth into the fabric of the territory. "And you are nothing but a fading footnote in my story." She gestured slightly with her hand. Gavin Thorne hauled the screaming, thrashing stepmother to her feet, dragging her and the weeping Elena away from the dais, banishing them permanently to the deep, lightless obsidian keeps beneath the mountains. They would never see the sun again, as the heavy iron doors slammed shut behind the traitors, sealing their fate forever. The entire elite assembly of the Silverpine Pack collapsed to their knees. Hundreds of proud, arrogant nobles pressed their foreheads to the dusty granite floor, offering absolute, unquestionable submission to the quiet Omega they had once discarded. Draven remained kneeling in the center of the hall, waiting for her judgment. Maria walked back to him, her grey wool skirts brushing against the stone. She stopped before him, the ambient golden warmth of her magic wrapping around his massive, scarred shoulders like a protective physical embrace. She reached down with steady, calloused hands and gently cupped his handsome, tear-streaked face, forcing him to look up into her deep, profound eyes. "You will spend the rest of your life earning my trust. Draven," she murmured, her voice a soft, intimate whisper meant only for him, cutting through the heavy silence of the kneeling court. "But you will do it standing beside me. Rise, my king." 5 months later, the capital of the Silverpine territory was entirely unrecognizable. The oppressive, freezing gloom that had plagued the packhouse was a distant, forgotten nightmare. The cavernous stone halls were permanently infused with the deep, comforting scent of beeswax, fresh cedar, and blooming summer flora. But the most profound transformation had occurred in the grand royal courtyard, which had been physically altered from a sterile, cold granite staging ground into a sprawling, sun-drenched sanctuary garden. The afternoon sun filtered down through the thick canopy of ancient emerald-green oak trees, casting warm, dappled light across the lush, vibrant grass, Beds of wild, golden sunlilies and fragrant white gardenias bloomed in absolute defiance of the harsh northern climate, sustained entirely by the continuous, ambient warmth radiating from the pack's true sovereign. Maria sat on a beautifully carved wooden bench beneath the shade of a massive willow tree. She did not wear the heavy, suffocating royal silks preferred by her predecessors. Instead, she wore a simple, flowing gown of soft white cotton, her dark hair cascading freely over her shoulders, adorned only with a delicate crown woven from actual silver threads and living sun lilies. The physical toll of her past suffering had completely vanished. Her skin glowed with a healthy, vibrant heat, and the golden tetherbrand on her left wrist hummed with a deep, honeyed warmth, an ever-present, somatic reassurance of absolute safety. A few yards away, Toby Miller ran across the sunlit grass, his small boots kicking up loose petals. The young, once mute orphan was laughing, a bright, joyous sound that echoed through the garden, entirely healed from the trauma of his past. He was chasing a large, beautifully carved wooden wolf, holding it high in the air as if it were flying through the summer breeze. Maria watched the boy with a soft, quiet smile, her heart expanding with a profound, maternal, fierce protectiveness. She had built a sanctuary in the ice, but now she had turned the entire kingdom into a haven. Heavy, measured footsteps approached the bench. Draven Valerius stepped into the shade of the willow tree, his massive, imposing frame a stark, visual contrast to the delicate beauty of the blooming garden. The Alpha King wore a simple, unbuttoned linen shirt that revealed the thick, jagged burn scars sprawling across his chest, a constant, physical reminder of the day he had thrown his life away to shield hers. Despite his terrifying reputation, his energy in her presence was entirely, miraculously gentle. He carried a silver tray, holding a steaming clay teapot and 2 cups of dried yarrow root tea, remembering exactly how she liked it from her days in the exile cabin. No woman lasted a night with him. The nobles had whispered in the dark corners of the pack house. But one woman did. One woman lasted a lifetime. Draven set the tray down on the small stone table beside the bench. He did not sit beside her. Instead, the most feared sovereign in 3 realms folded his massive frame and knelt in the soft grass at her feet, a gesture of absolute, permanent devotion that he performed daily without an ounce of hesitation. He rested his heavy arms gently in her lap, looking up at her with storm-grey eyes that overflowed with transparent, unadulterated adoration. The border patrols report that the northern passes are completely clear, Draven murmured, his deep, chest-rattling voice kept soft so as not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere. Gavin has established the new supply routes to the lower vales. The pack is thriving, Maria. The crops have never been richer. Because the land knows it is safe, Maria replied softly, her calloused fingers moving gently through his thick, dark hair. The tactile sensation sent a slow, burning pulse of molten gold through their fated tether, a deep, somatic purr of absolute contentment. She traced the edge of the jagged scar on his chest, her touch light and reverent, and because its king learned how to bleed for his people, rather than just command them. Draven closed his eyes, leaning heavily into her touch, his broad shoulders relaxing completely under her maternal, protective warmth. He reached up, his large, warm hand wrapping securely over her fingers, pressing her palm flat against his steadily beating heart. I am still earning this heartbeat. Every single day, he whispered, his voice catching with raw, residual emotion. I will never stop trying to balance the scales for what I put you through. Maria looked out across the vibrant, healing garden. She watched Toby stumble in the grass, only for a massive, heavily armored pack guard to gently catch the boy, setting him upright with a warm, encouraging smile. The brutal, toxic hierarchy of the past had been entirely dismantled, replaced by a fierce, chosen family that valued quiet resilience over violent dominance. You already balanced the scales, Draven, she murmured, her voice steady and rich with ancient truth, because monsters do not kneel to speak to children. Because monsters do not search through the freezing ice to find what they have broken. Because monsters do not look at me the way you do. Draven opened his eyes, the storm-grey irises reflecting the golden light of her soul, shining with unshed, grateful tears. He pulled her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles with deep, desperate reverence. "You are my entire world," he breathed against her skin, the vibration of his words sinking straight into her bones. "My sun, my Luna, my life." Maria smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that illuminated the shadows beneath the willow tree. She leaned down, pressing her forehead gently against his, letting the absolute, unbreakable warmth of their restored bond wash over them both. The cavernous void of the past was gone, incinerated by a love that had literally conquered death, the thawing of the northern territories. The elders would recount in hushed, reverent whispers for generations to come, was not brought about by the turning of the seasons or the simple melting of the winter snow. It was a profound cosmic miracle. It was about a broken, cursed king who was brought to his knees by his own catastrophic mistakes, and the quiet, resilient queen who taught him how to build a mended world from the ashes of his ruin. Small things mend the world, she had taught him, always. And as the golden afternoon sun bathed the Silverpine capital in perpetual, absolute warmth, the Alpha King and his true mate finally found their way home.